Well, a very good evening to you, and welcome to another program of Walter Rodney Groundings. We need to mute there. I'm your host, Deon Abrams, and on this evening's panel, well, not a panel, essentially, I have one guest, no stranger to you. He's Dr. David Hinds, and together we'll be talking about the current situation in Guyana and possibly where we need to go. Welcome to Walter Rodney Groundings, Dr. Hinds.
Thank you very much, Deon. Nice to be on again.
Well, it's good to have you back in Guyana. The political scene, life seems to be going on its merry way, as though all things are fine and dandy. What is your impression of what is happening in Guyana? I'm asking you a broad question.
I know it's a broad question. There's a way in which Guyana is what I would call a constant place. It's a country that's always seemed to be on the brink of something, either the brink of a breakthrough or the brink of some kind of big explosion. And there are countries that function like that. Let's take a country like Haiti, for example. Haiti has always been there on the brink. Not a failed state, but there and thereabout. And I do think that Guyana is fast becoming like that. That one of those countries in which there is never a happy story to tell. And I'm talking here at the political level, because I think at the level of the masses of people, there are lots of happy stories. But at the public political level, there is never this happy story to tell. There's never a story that here we have had a problem and we have solved this problem amicably. Here, it's always about the next crisis. It puts people on the edge, and it affects the way in which people go about their normal lives. I don't want to say that Guyana is a failed state, because I don't think it is a failed state, but it is definitely a failing state, definitely a state that is on the brink of what we may call dysfunction, political dysfunction.
So in that sense, you're differing from some of the people like Freddie Kissoon who were saying that Guyana has failed.
And I have sympathy, because in some regards they're correct. I mean, it's just a matter of degrees, right? Failing or failed state is a matter of degree. I like to think about things in process. I would like to think of Guyana as a place in which there are forces who would like to take it in a particular direction. They would like to take it over the precipice, but there are always forces who are trying to hold it back and forces who are trying to correct the situation. So in that sense, I would not put it as an end in itself, that it is a failed state, but it is a failing state. It is a state that is tending in that direction, trending in that direction, but there are forces who are trying their level best to make sure that it does not reach that point where you can say once and for all that it's a failed state.
Okay, so the prorogation of Parliament, the announcement of the President, are you pleased with the response of the major players to what has been transpiring in Guyana? I mean, from 2011 to now, in terms of the abuse of the powers of the President, the disregard for Parliament, the culmination with prorogation, and this promise of the calling of elections. Are you pleased with the way the people, and essentially the leaders, presumed leaders of the people, have responded?
Well, let me answer that in historical terms, as I always try to do. There is, has been in Guyana, a struggle since 1955 for power between the major players and sometimes among the major players. And that struggle for power has taken on an ethnic element, and that's been dominant, but it has also taken on an element of do or die. I have my hand on power, and I am going to hold on to it for my life. And I think the experience of the last 22 years under the PPP government, has been a lesson for political leaders and political activists and political thinkers, because the PPP government came as a result of a struggle to dismantle a past authoritarian government. The government had been there from 1964 to 1992, and it had taken the country in a certain direction. And there were forces, as I mentioned at the beginning, who tried to pull it back from that direction. So we had a struggle between 64 and 1992 to take the country in an authoritarian direction, but also a struggle to bring it back from authoritarianism. And in the end, in 1992, through a coming together of forces, some of the forces inside of the PNC itself, because one cannot take away from the fact that Desmond Hoyt played an important role in leading the quote-unquote democratization of the state and the society. But I would want to say something that probably has not been said many times before, that for Barnum, even before his death in 1985, had signaled that he himself had begun to have second thoughts of the commandist kind of state and authoritarian state that had developed under his watch. And I think the assassination of Dr. Walter Rodney had a pivotal role to play with that, because what Rodney's assassination did was it mobilized forces, global forces against what was happening in Guyana, and put Guyana under the microscope, so to speak. And I think the government of the day was bound to respond to that, and Burnham had begun to grapple with the contradiction, all right, that comes out of managing an authoritarian state. And then when he died, Desmond Hoyt played a major role, but there were also external forces, the end of the Cold War, and most importantly, the quote-unquote anti-dictatorial forces inside of Guyana, who played important role: the Working People's Alliance, the People's Progressive Party, trade unions, the Democratic Labor Movement. All the forces came together. And so in 1992, we really brought an end to a particular phase. But here is the story. The end of authoritarianism does not necessarily mean democracy. We now learn that. The end of authoritarianism could lead to a further an elaboration of authoritarian forces. And that's what we've had since 1992. Instead of the end of authoritarianism leading to a democratic society, what it has led to is a much more authoritarian society. And this authoritarian society and state is developed under the guise of democracy, and that's what is dangerous about the situation that we have had for the last 22 years. That is a dictatorship that functions under this guise of it being a democracy. And so therefore what that means is that certain forces that would normally speak out and protest against authoritarianism were hesitant to do so because of this so-called democracy that we came back to democracy in 1992. What we now know is that that is a lie, right? What we did was to end one form of dictatorial state and society, and it had been replaced by a more vicious form of dictatorship. Professor Clive Thomas, our colleague in the WPA, talks about the criminalization of the state. That is something that was not there before, but is there, the way in which the state itself has become the embodiment of criminalization in terms of corruption, in terms of political assassinations, in terms of assassinations and killings of normal people. And so when you have the criminalization of the state merging with the racialization of the state, because that's something that we don't like to talk about. There's a way in which this state has been made to, if not serve the interests of one ethnic group, because East Indians would argue very strongly that the state does not represent their interests, and I think that is largely correct. But what this state has done is this state has functioned in an anti-black, an anti-African way. So even if it does not function as a pro-East Indian state, it has certainly functioned as an anti-black state, because its nemesis, the PNC, is seen as the representation of blackness, the epitome of blackness. So in the pushback and the marginalization of the PNC, what has happened is that there's been what Freddie Kissoon called an ideological racism that finds itself in the government and the state. So what you have is the criminalization of the state, the racialization of the state, and when you put that two together, then you have this dangerous and frightening situation that we saw in the conversation by Mr. Nandalal, where he talks about the chatri. That's the racialization of the state, right? And then he talks about what is likely to happen to Kaitro News. That's the criminalization of the state coming. So you see, and that is why that Nandalal's statement is so important and should not be taken lightly. No, I say all of that to answer your question, whether in fact the leaders have really, if I'm satisfied. And the answer is no, because I don't think that the leaders, certainly the leaders on the opposition side, have sufficiently grasped the nature of what they're dealing with. And I'm not saying this in a way to denigrate them, because I think opposition leaders are always having a difficult time in dealing with a state and a society of like Guyana. But I think there is not a grasping of the nature of what they're dealing with. And if you don't grasp the real nature of what you're dealing with, then your corrective measures tend to fall short. Now, here is where 2011 came in. Because I think the Guyanese people did something really fundamental. They at the electoral level, they put a stop, if you will. They say enough is enough. Part of the East Indian community peeled away. The African Guyanese community stood up, and we had the peeling away and the standing up, coming together to give the quote-unquote AFC and the APNU, the opposition, an opportunity to put a stop, a definitive stop to what has been happening. No, that's where your question comes in. Have they adequately taken advantage of what was given to them in 2011? And I think the answer to that question has to be, in the final analysis, they've not done an altogether adequate job at doing that. Not that they've not done a good job. I think they've done a good job, but I think more could have been done with the opening that was given to them. So we come to prorogation, and prorogation is really the response of a government that finds itself in crisis, but a government which is bold enough to take that extreme measure, feeling that there would not be an adequate response to it. So that's part of what I see in the prorogation. I see a desperate executive, right, trying to cling on to power. But I also see an executive that feels bold enough to say, I'm going to poke you in the eye and see what you do. And I think that's what that prorogation was all about.
Okay, well, we'll deal with that a little more. But you talked about the forces, the criminalization, the racialization. I think when we talk about the racial context, we're using Nandalal, yes, because he is simply speaking what possibly is the embodiment of the politics of the PPP. But we should also remember what Jack Deon said when the Indians were protesting against, what he considered things that are of little concern, that they should look at the bigger picture. And this bigger picture, often, I think people don't understand what it means in terms of the racial context and the ideology of the PPP. I don't know if you have a perspective on Jack Deon's idea of a bigger picture in terms of the Indian Guyanese community.
Well, the bigger picture is that Indians should not break ranks. That part of what we are doing is to protect you. We are carrying out these rogue activities. We are leading a rogue government. We are engage in the criminalization of the state in order to protect you. That's what they're saying to East Indians, all right? And one has to put that in perspective, Deon, because I think often we forget that between 1957 and 1964, that the PPP had been in power, and the PPP had tried during that period to do what ethnic parties do in societies like ours, which was to hold on to power at all costs. No, we were still a colony, and so it was difficult to do that within the quote-unquote colonial context. And so a combination of forces led to the fall of that government. It was illegal. It was a legal demise of the PPP. It was done through elections. We often hear the story that the PPP was hounded out of power as if there was some undemocratic way in which the PPP got out of power. The PPP got out of power because it did not get a majority of the vote, just as in 2011, all right? And so the two other parties came together in the new system of proportional representation to form a government. In that case, it was the UF and the PNC. But they were able to capture both the executive branch and the legislative branch. Now, it's the same result that we got in 2011, where the PPP did not get a majority of the vote, but this time the two parties, the AFC and the APNU, could only come together and capture control of the legislative branch. They could not control the executive branch because the constitution was changed in 1980 to make a party with a plurality of the vote capture the presidency and the executive. So the big picture here for the PPP is that we were cheated, to use Dr. Jagan's term, we were cheated out of office in 1964. And so, therefore, when we come back to power in 1992, there are two things that are going to happen here. We are going to ensure that we take revenge for what was done to us for 28 years. And secondly, we are going to ensure that we will never be, quote-unquote, cheated out of power again. And what cheated out of power means is that here we have the majority vote in this country in terms of East Indians supporting us. So we are guaranteed a majority vote. And that guarantee of the majority East Indian vote is then taken to mean we have a God-given right to govern. So not being cheated out of office means that we will not be moved from office. So even when you're moved by a majority vote in 2011, because of the mindset that this is your God-given right to govern, and there's this big picture, all right, that East Indians are supposed to ensure that we remain in power, that even when that is broken in 2011, the PPP behaves as though nothing has happened.
But for me also, the bigger picture involves all of the things that the PPP would have done to cement, not necessarily as you said, a majority of the East Indians, but to give, you know, the state and the control that they have of it, to use it as a means of aggrandizing, you know, the conditions of some of its acolytes. Yeah. You know, the giving away of the telecommunication spectrum, the granting of radio licenses, all of these things, protection of the criminal enterprises and all of these things, what we call a criminal cabal.
Yeah.
And that they see as, for them, even though it may involve a small clique, they want all the broad masses of Indians to see it as something that is accruing to them.
Yeah. And that's a critical point, Deon, because if one should do a comparative analysis of Guyanese politics, what separates the PNC during its term in office, during its authoritarian period, and the PPP's authoritarianism, is that there was not the level of kleptomanianism, if I may create a term. There was not the level of official corruption as policy. See, this is what we have to talk about here in the PPP. The pillaging of state resources is something that all governments across the world do. We have, all governments, use state resources to do all kinds of things. What separates this government from previous governments in Guyana and governments across the rest of the Caribbean and the hemisphere is the extent to which corruption, what we call corruption, has become the norm has become the practice. It has become what drives policy. When one hears of the extent of the corruption, the extent of the appropriation of public lands, public property, when one hears about all the misappropriation of funds, when one sees what goes on in the telecommunication sector, who gets license for things, when one looks at who gets contracts, and so on. What one sees there, all right, is really a practice of the state that has become the norm. and this is what is frightening, because you have a whole generation of young people, who, if you were born in 1985, 1984, you were 80 years old in 1992 when the PPP came to power. You are 30 years old today. You have children. So you have a whole generation and their children who would have known no other practice of government than the one over the last 22 years. And what that practice of government says is that, look, the misappropriation of funds, the use of the government for personal aggrandizement, the use of public facilities for personal benefit and so on, is acceptable. And so you find a number of young people are really growing up grappling with this issue, and some of them seem to have no problem with that kind of behavior, because that's the norm. They have nothing else to compare it with. And so that's why we have to be hammering over and over again that there was a time when Guyana was not like that, and there ought to be a time, we ought to imagine a time when Guyana will not be like that. Because it's not just about condemning the PPP, it's about saving this nation from seeing itself in those terms. Because there was a way in which certain things were not encouraged in the society. Today, people encourage them in the society because they seem to think it's okay. Because governments are there not just to govern, but also to set an example for what this society should look like. And certainly when you listen to that tape, and I go back to the Nandalal tape, because I think it's a public document that the entire country could hear and see how the Attorney General, one of the most influential public officials in this country, what is his thought process. Some may say, but that's his private thoughts. But by God, on the issues of race, on the issues of violence, on the issues of corruption, race, violence, and corruption, you should not have a separate private view from your public view. All right? We expect that our public officials, their private views on race, on corruption, on public morality should be the same as their public view. And so therefore, I don't think that excuse that it was a private conversation. It was a private conversation about public business by a public person. And I think, as Professor Clive Thomas said at the WPA symposium, that tape showed the extent to which the government has crossed the line. And I want to re-emphasize that here today, that we are in the presence of a deranged state. We are in the presence, if we had any compunctions or any doubts about whether this state, whether the opposition was inaccurate when they characterized the state in those draconian terms, whether they're wrong or right, that tape spoke for itself. Yes, it was Nandalal, one person. Yes, it was a private tape, but it was a person who represents one of the highest decision-making institutions of the state.
But you're forgetting one point, that on several instances, the other party was saying, man, this thing is being recorded, you know. People are listening into this conversation, and he himself said, I ain't got a kind of technology, man, you know. So even though the idea that it could be public was intimated to Nandalal, he disregarded that, and he continued the conversation. So, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but I mean, in any other country, that revelation, regardless of whether it was private or public, would have led to serious repercussions. Look at the Sterling case in the United States.
Yes.
That was a private conversation.
Yes.
You know, he was the owner of an NBA team, and he made very, dastardly remarks about black people and so on. And he paid for it. He lost the entire team.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why didn't they say that that was a private conversation? You see, there's a difference in terms of people's perception of things when they want to fit it into their own scheme. And that is an example. If it were a different society, it means that we're dealing with a government here that, is not prepared to act in any way that is democratic, in any way that gives a semblance of decency and any sense of what is right. And that is what we have to consider.
Yes, and Deon, and part of that, as I intimated earlier, has to do with their own perception of the rest of us. As we would say in normal Guyanese parlance, they ice pass us. And there's a way in which this government really ice pass all of us. And often, for me, politics is not just about what you do at the top in government. Politics is more so about what you do, how it affects ordinary people. And I think often when we carry on the conversation about politics, we really don't talk about those ordinary people, those people on the streets, those people who are selling at the corner of the streets, those people in the market, the young people who are in the villages have nothing to do, who are in the wards of the town. A lot of these people, people like us, we have to deal with them because we are accessible to them, and so therefore they speak to us about their own pain, about what is happening at the top and how it affects them. And I think one of the things that I want to make that criticism of all politicians on both sides of the divide, not just those in government, that we think about politics too much in terms of process, too much in terms of system, and not in terms of people. I'm saying, people say to me, well, David, you are always very passionate, and you sometimes get angry, and you get that criticism too. And often my own anger and passion is really a reflection of what I see as the advantage that's taken on ordinary people who don't have a voice to speak up. And so I think that if someone like myself, someone like you, who can come on the airwaves, and so therefore we have a voice to speak up for all to hear, that we should reflect what those people are thinking. That is, one needs to ask a question. Whether you're the opposition, the prorogue is happening, and the opposition has to answer, what do we do about this? I think the question has to be, what would the ordinary masses of people want us to do about this? You see? And I don't think that as political people, we ask that question sufficiently. We take the masses for granted. We sometimes ignore the masses and what they say. And we look at the process, and we look at what is tactically correct. And we look at what is good for the party. And do not ask ourselves what is good for the people. Let me give you an example. And I want to say this on public television because I've not heard it said. The vast majority of people who voted for the PPP are East Indians. The PPP take advantage of them. We know that, but they voted for them. The vast majority of people who voted for the APNU are Africans. The president prorogues the parliament. The parliament is suspended, but the executive branch is still working. It means that those people who voted for the executive branch, the PPP, still have some representation in government. The people who voted for the APNU, read me, black people, in this country as we speak here tonight, have no representation in this country because their representatives are in the parliament is shut down. So there is a racial implication of prorogation that sometimes our people don't talk about, our leaders, but the people on the streets know that. It is they who say to me, but David, it's black people who vote for the APNU. So when you put the APNU out of parliament, where we representation there? And so if we listen to people, then we get a better sense of what they're thinking. Yeah, and so you heard it here on this program, that African Guyanese, as we sit here, have absolutely no representation in government because their representatives have been shoved out of the parliament because of the proroguing of that parliament. East Indians at least could say, But the executive, we vote for them, and so we have some representation as we speak. And so one answers the question, therefore, about prorogation and what it means for the ordinary people. And I think that our leaders really have to pay more attention to what those people on the ground are feeling. They're poor, they're being taken advantage of by the police, they're being taken advantage of by the economic system. They don't have jobs. The education system is failing them. And I think we go on with politics as though it's not about them, right? So they can wait. The people suffering could wait, right? We're going to maneuver and see what we will do with this government thing. What is happening while we're doing that? What is happening to the masses of people on the ground? You and I are from Buxton, right? We walk around that village, right? And people, ordinary people, children, stop us. Man, Deon, one David, explain to we what is happening. We go, people leave their party and they come to ask that question. I go into other villages. I walk through those villages and it's the same question. I think as political people, we have to, what a poem we used to say years ago on the street, you have to think with the mind of the people, you have to hear with the ears of the people, and you have to speak with the voice of the people. And I think we don't do much of that, enough of that.
Well, I mean, you're taking me down a road that I really didn't want to go, because if you listen to some of our politicians, they're doing just that. You know, our constituents are satisfied with what we are doing, what we have been doing. We are listening to our constituency. Which constituency? Are we talking about the same constituency?
Well, perhaps we're talking. But there is a way in which the constituency may tell them something different they tell us, yeah? Because there is a way in which people communicate. The way, look, Guyanese people are by our very nature very polite people, and I think when our leaders come, it's a good thing, but it's also a failing. I think when our leaders come to us, we are very polite, and sometimes we give them the impression that we are not revved up, we are not worked up, and then when they see the quote-unquote what they perceive to be grassroots political people like you and me, they open up to us, because there is a way in which they can communicate with us. They feel free to open up and be raw with us, and I think we sometimes hear them at a gut level that the other politicians, so in fairness to the other politicians, perhaps they are reading that politeness to mean satisfaction. Right. Okay. So, you know, in fairness to them. Right.
Okay. I like that, David. Diplomacy at its highest level.
Well, no, it's the truth. You know, we Buxtonians are not very good diplomats, right? It's a story. You know, Brother UC says when in 1964 the new government came to power, they asked him to go to the United Nations to be our first ambassador, and he said he asked the leader, what am I going to do there? I am not a diplomat. My place is with people in Guyana and so on. No, I come from the Guyana tradition. I'm not a diplomat. But I understand what you mean. That I'm a little soft.
Well, you know, I mean, we're not here to rub anybody's thing. I think people have to understand, you know, that sometimes their perception of a mass view is not what other people are feeling. All right, and sometimes we have to question where they get that concept from, that their position is a mass position.
Right, you know? And that is why leadership rather than leaders become important. Sometimes we get caught up in the one leader thing, because there's a way in which what Mr. Granger, Mr. Ramutar, or Mr. Ramjatan hear as leaders, as the leaders, they hear what people tell leaders. But there are others in the party, others in the struggle, who people feel more free to say. And so if we were to sometimes take into consideration that leadership is much more important than the leader, then we get a more balanced sense of what people are thinking out there. And I'm very glad you raised that point, because often some of our own comrades, some of our own people we work with tend to think that, you know, you guys in the WP are constantly accusing and criticizing the leadership to which you are part of, And I usually answer that by saying, well, yeah, we come from a tradition of self-criticism. That is, it is very unhealthy, right, to be part of the leadership and not being critical of your own self. And, you know, I mean, there's something that they've developed in the Caribbean. They said, don't wash your dirty linen in public. Well, we don't come from that tradition. We come from a tradition that is influenced by A.U.C. Quine, I mentioned his name, and Walter Rodney, which talks about self-criticism. And I think it's a very healthy thing.
Well, it's part of the process of democracy. If you're inculcating the idea that people must not criticize you, I mean, then obviously your tendency is not a good one, I mean, for leadership.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
I mean, when we speak here, we are speaking because of how we feel, of how we are sensing, and from the responses we get from people in the society, and we're hoping that at least somebody will hear.
That's right. That's right. And not, I mean, it's not. We're not sniping.
It's not trying to bring anybody down or anything. It's just trying to make you understand that. Well, look, I mean, some of the positions that you're taking are not in, you know, keeping with what we believe are reasonable and so on. And we're reflecting the views of people who we meet on the streets and talk to. And so, I mean, people may be angry about it because their tradition and culture, political culture, might be different.
Yeah. And let it be known, Deon, that the WPA, and I want to say a couple of things about the WPA and this whole political process and so forth. We've developed a culture in Guyana, in the rest of the Caribbean, in that we measure the importance of political parties and political forces by how many votes they get. Well, there's so many votes to go around. And when you come to election, it's about who could win and who could not win and so forth. And so there are different calculations there. And we live in a political culture that really doesn't have a place for third parties as electoral parties. But we do have a place for third and fourth and fifth parties as parties that engage in political discourse, that engage in the democratization, that engage in politics outside of electoral politics. And so we in the WPA have never been a strong, our party has never been a strong electoral party. But we have played a pivotal role in the history of this society over the last 40 years. When it is honestly written, the role and the contributions of the WPA will be written very, 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 very large in that history. And we continue to play a role in that society. We are, as a party, we are grounded in certain philosophy. And one aspect of our philosophy is that we must be able to work with people who we do not see eye to eye with in the interest of the nation. And so therefore we played a very equal role in the bringing to being of the APNU. And so therefore when one talks about where the APNU is today, one has to talk not just about which party was big and which party was small. One has to talk about how all of us as political forces were able to bring our energies together and to create something new that excited this nation. All right? And so we do not want to claim victory or claim kudos, but we just want to say to those who share out kudos, all right, to say while we do not claim kudos, we want to go on record as saying that we continue to play our role in this society because there is historical role for all forces, all right? We had occasion to say at the symposium that we held the other day at the National Library. We want to say that we had on that panel Professor Thomas, who is WPA, we had Mr. Carl Greenwich, who is PNC, and we had Mr. Christopher Ram, who is quote-unquote independent. And so that's our philosophy. It was a WPA symposium, but we did not pack the platform with WPA people. We felt that part of what we should be doing is trying to bring this nation together. And that is why for all of our criticisms of the PPP and our vehemence of the PPP, we should not let that deter us from saying that the solution of this, the political solution of this country has to involve the PPP. So long as 40%, 50%, 60% of this population the population. So long as 80% of Indians vote for the PPP, we have to respect that. We may not like the rogues in the lead of the leadership of the PPP, but we have to not allow their behavior to deviate us from the position that what we are fighting for in this country is not to replace a PPP government with a PNC government or an AFC government. We're done with that. We did that in 1992. What we are trying to do is to change one-party rule in this country and to replace it with a form of governance that all ethnic and social groups in this country can feel comfortable with. I continue to find it a rather harsh injustice that African Guyanese little boys and girls could not reasonably aspire to become the ultimate leader of this country because of the reality of an ethnic vote. I think that is a travesty of justice that has to be corrected, because when one section of the population feels deflated, then that weighs on the society itself. Okay? And so we have to correct that. So I just wanted to say that about our own role in the WPA. We have always been a party that has spoken what the Americans call truth to power. All right? The black Americans call truth to power. We've always been a party that is engaged in a public discourse, because part of what we are doing here is in the Rodneyite tradition. Walter Rodney said very clearly, I went to university, I became Dr. Walter Rodney, I became this internationally known scholar on the backs of the ordinary Guyanese people who made my education possible. And so therefore, part of my duty is to come back and give back to this nation. And that is why we are here every Sunday. Part of what we're doing is critiquing, but largely, I hope what we're doing is educating our people. Educating our people about the issues, the current issues, drawing lessons with history, and using that, as what Guyana said, to give the people as their own nourishment, so they can see their role and their relevance in this society. And one of the things that we are very, very firm on is that we must never give up the right to protest, the right to resist. And I know that's something that you feel very strongly about.
I was going to go there because we talked about struggle. You mentioned that the WPA played an integral role in the restoration of what we thought would have been democracy, and that it was integrally involved in the struggle for that renewal. What form did this struggle take? I mean, during the time of the WPA?
Many forms, many forms. Be it street protests, marches, demonstrations, pickets. We also used the courts very effectively. We had other forms. Guyana would go on a hunger strike. Deon, you know what it would do to the struggle in this country if one of the leaders of the APNU and a leader of the AFC were to decide that we are going to go in front of that parliament and we are going to sit there and engage in a hunger strike to draw attention to the kind of atrocity that passes for governance in this country. You know what it would mean? When we talk about more forceful form of struggle, we're not just talking about going out on the streets, we're not talking about breaking up people's property, we're talking about using all the means at our disposal to draw attention to the kind of degradation that's happening in this country. So we use all forms. We use hunger strikes, we use pickets, demonstrations, sitting, days of rest, you know. Marches. You know, what is it? To ask this country, let us take one day of rest. Let us not go to work. Let us not drive our minibuses. Let us not do anything. Let us bring this country to a standstill. Not by raising a finger. We don't even have to go on the streets. The WPA held 2 days of rest in 1983. The only place we went on the street was Buxton, because the Buxtonians came to Brother UC and myself and my brother at that time. You were a youngster, you were part of it, and said, we can't have a day of rest without a march. And we went over to Annandale and got the East Indians, and we brought them into Buxton and we marched. And the police arrested you, were a youngster, them arrested a number of us, and took us before the court and so on. That's a story. But the point is, a day of rest. bringing this country to a standstill is perhaps one of the most militant moves that you can take. So the point I'm making, the government, of course, reduces protests to marches and demonstrations, and we have fallen into that, right? There are creative ways of protest. Dr. Rupnarayan talked about going to the Square of the Revolution and getting the Chronicle and all those things and burn them there. That demonstrates to this nation that, look, we know what is happening and we are using whatever means that are at our disposal, short of violence and so forth, in order to bring this country to its senses. But in that sense, I think we have allowed the government not only to dictate the agenda, but also to dictate what is protest. And in that regard, we have what? We have handcuffed ourselves as far as protests and resistance are concerned.
But we find that people are, because you said they have dictated, but we find that, you know, our leaders are accepting that, because when you make a statement that we need more vigorous protests, they're taking it in the context of mashing up the country and riots and wars and so on. I mean, and that is a sad thing, really.
Yes.
Because it shows a sense that, you know, they're not thinking real politically, you know, and strategically in terms of a movement to win whatever they're fighting for. And I don't know. Somebody needs to be educated.
Well, we hope that we are playing our role, and we hope the people of this country, whenever they see the leaders, really let them know that what they mean is that they don't mean that we must go and break up the country. What they mean is that we must stand up. We must stand up. Okay? It's okay to have a little picket. You know, we picket. That's effective. But that picket has to be supplemented by some other things. Now, I know it's Christmas, and we always hear the business people on Christmas and so on and so forth. You know, I mean, I have sympathy with business people, you know, because they have to make a living too.
But they ain't got sympathy.
You know, but I don't think the business people have sympathy for ordinary working people of this country. Because the business people ought to be able, you know, to stand up and to say to this government, you're wrong. You are wrong. But the business people themselves, some of them, a class of them, they're benefiting from the kind of policies and the kind of corruption that are going on. And so therefore, all they're concerned about is making money. And they're not standing by the side of the masses. But yet when it comes to Christmas or whenever it comes to wherever, we're always told, well, we can't protest because it will affect business. And I think we have to have a frank discussion in this country about the role of private businesses, because in other parts of the world, private businesses, some of them stand on the side of the masses. And I would like to call on those private businessmen and women. I'm not talking about the ordinary people on the side of the street who hustling and living. I'm talking about the big Chamber of Commerce people who are always telling us, calling for peace, and we mustn't go on the streets and so on. What do they do for this society? How many of them are going into Anns Grove, or going into Buxton, or going into Den Amstel, and saying, let us deal with the question of unemployment there? How many of them are giving back to help the ordinary people in those places? We spend money on their businesses, and they do not give back in terms of social programs, in terms of helping the society. Sometimes they give a little scholarship here. They help an individual. That's an individual. What we are talking about is the chronic poverty, impoverishment of this country. You're a teacher, and your salary is just enough to pay your rent and your passage. You are a nurse. Your salary is just enough to pay your passage and to buy your uniform, to put some food on the table, and maybe pay your rent. They're ordinary young people who are graduating from university and can't find decent jobs that can pay them so that they can even pay back their loans. What are the private businesses, what are they doing about that? And so I always feel that we have to have a frank discussion about that. Don't tell me that we can't exercise our democratic right to protest because it will affect business, when those businesses do not care about our democratic right to work, to earn a decent wage, to have proper health care in this country. They do not think about those things. And so I'm saying, until private businesses begin to play their civic and patriotic role, you should not call on the masses always to protect private property. Private businesses, sorry, not private property, private businesses. Private businesses must protect poor people. And if you protect poor people, then it will be then the right thing to ask poor people to protect you. But it can't be one side. Why should poor people, why should poor ordinary people always have to be the ones who must protect other people and nobody protects them?
And that's a critical point. But another side of the business community, I mean, we've been hearing these things on the streets, but I see the Kaieteur News today in its Dembaise column is really hitting at something that people should read about. I don't want to talk about it because this is what people have been saying as a reason why a lot of the activism is lacking in many of the political parties and it's talking about the business community paying politicians and parties. It's a serious thing, accusation. If it is true, then we really in deep waters.
There is a relationship between private businesses and campaign finance. We can no longer sweep it under the carpet.
Okay.
Right? To run a campaign in this country now, it's tens of millions of dollars. And often, it's business people you have to go to. Poor people don't have that money to contribute. They have to go to business people. And business people, as business people are always want to do, ask for their pound of flesh in return. And so a lot of democratic practice and democratic politics in this country, a lot of it is stymied by this consideration about getting money to run your campaign. Now, I am not being a fool. You need money to run your campaigns, and you have to go to private businesses. But you have to have a cutoff. You have to have a point where you say, I'm going to take your money, right? Because I need your money to help with the campaign and so on. But there's a line. Don't ask me. Don't ask me to then in turn protect you. Don't ask me to then in turn go against the sentiments of my constituency in order to protect you. Don't ask me to call off democratic protests against prorogation because you give me a couple $1,000s for my campaign. The WPA is frank, and we are being frank here today. This is a discussion. We recognize that businesses have to function in this country, and they should not be fearful that people would, during protests, go and break up their businesses. Businesses have a right to contribute to political parties. That is their democratic right. But what is not acceptable is for that contribution to be in exchange for the people's right to protest and to stand up. In Jamaica, which is not known in this country, I'm sure, Jamaica just passed the law that the government must now finance political parties, and not just campaigns, but to finance the political parties. Now, how that will work in practice, we don't know, but at least they've recognized that parties have become prisoners of private money, and so they're saying, look, the government should step in and not just finance campaigns, but also finance the parties themselves. Now, we don't know how that will work itself out, but in principle,
it's a good idea.
It's a good idea, all right? Because my own view here in this country is that private businesses have a big business. And again, I'm not talking about my brothers and sisters them in a little store, the little thing at the corner of the street, the little store employing 5 and 10 people. I'm not talking about them. They're hustling, just like you and me, all right? They're called businesses, but they're really workers who own a little shop here, little shop working people who own a little shop. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the big businesses who ought to know better, but who in this country ask for not just a pound of flesh, they ask for everything.
Yeah, well, that's because it's clearly stated. Generally, because we've been hearing that, and if Kaieteur News has picked it up, then it means it's something that is becoming pretty pervasive.
Yeah.
And it should be a concern to those who the fingers are being pointed at. There's one other thing that we talk about, the whole question of, we talked about, the whole question of struggle, the fact that, people believe that more should be done. We have the announcement of the president. We're looking at the PPP, their public relation entire public relations strategy right now, campaign strategy, is bastardizing the opposition, saying that they worked under a system that was not conducive to development, and if they are given the chance to take control as they used to, that things will be better in the next dispensation.
Yeah.
Is that a reality? Did they display any sense of concern for people prior to the 2011 elections? What will make it different come elections 2015?
You hit the nail on the head there. And but more importantly, when we got the result in 2011, if they were really concerned about this country, the first thing they would have done was to do what any decent party concerned about the welfare of this country was to say, the people of this country have voted not for a one-party government. They have voted for a multi-party government. And if we are concerned about development in this country, we will call the AFC and call the APNU and say, let's form a government of national unity. This is what the people want. This is what the people voted for. And therefore, it would not be, the opposition would not then be in a position to quote-unquote stymie your developmental thing. In fact, you and I would argue that the opposition has really not stymied your program. If the opposition were to listen to people like myself and thing, you would not be last. You would not be here 3 years now to talk about this. Because the first thing that we would ask for, give me my share of the government. We got 51% of the vote, and it cannot mean 0% of the government. Give me share. Let's talk about that before we talk about any program or anything, any budget. Before you go to any budget, let's talk about my share. All right? And we felt that the opposition should have taken that road. The time has passed. We are now here in 2014, going into 2015. And as we look forward, we're hoping that as we go to the election, whatever the result, that those results would lead to a government in which all of us will feel satisfied. I do not see. If the PPP wins a majority again at the coming election, I don't see how that will advance this country. If we get the same situation that we have now, whereas one party wins the presidency and the other two parties together get the parliament, if you continue to behave the same way you behave in the last 3 years, I don't see how that will benefit Guyana. Now, some people are arguing, well, the alternative is for an APNU AFC government. Now, I think I've lived long enough to be afraid of a part government, right? Now, that would be better than a PPP government. I know, for supporters of the opposition who are listening, that an AFC APNU government would be better than a PPP government. Yes, I guarantee that. But in the end, we have to look at the big picture. The best form of government in this country would be a government in which all of its people feel satisfied. Only then can we begin to talk about the development and solving the problems that we're talking about.
Okay, time is catching up on us. But you know, we have spoken a lot about the fact that all of the projects, practically all of them, Mr. Greenidge said it, Professor Thomas said it, you know, Christopher repeated it. And people must be educated about these things because the PPP continues to try to pull a wool over people's eyes that the Amelia Falls Hydro project would have benefited. You see, the oil prices are basically gone to the lowest level.
Yes, yes.
Which means that the Amelia project would have been still, based upon their calculation, at $70 how much dollars a barrel. You know, it means that they would have been charging a whole lot of money for electricity, even though prices are going down. It's the same thing that they're doing currently with the gas prices.
Yeah.
Fuel prices have gone radically low, and our prices have not shifted because every time the price goes down, the tax keeps going up.
Yes.
Right? So the government continues to rake in a windfall on the backs of the people.
Yeah.
It is not in any way, and now if that is something that the world looks forward to, fuel prices going down, because in America right now, the economy is thriving on that because businesses are now willing to employ people to invest, you know, to move forward, and the economy is booming.
Yeah.
We are going nowhere because we are not benefiting from any of that. So this government, despite its pretense that it cares about people, certainly does not care, right? And they talk about the specialty hospital, the benefits that would have. We've lost over $4 billion already, and it hasn't gone anywhere.
Yeah.
You know, the Amelia Falls project is the same thing. You know, the Marriott Hotel that they're talking so much about, how are we going to benefit? So every project, the Skeldon Sugar Factory continues to, you know, milk the nation. And they want to uphold these things as, you know, things that are going to benefit us. So I think we need a process of educating the people that, well, look, this government will continue on a road that will be clouded in secrecy and will certainly not benefit the country in any way. I hope that we're going to have that kind of campaign to counter all of the foolishness that they've been peddling. All right? But time has caught up with us. I don't know if you have any last words that you want to say.
No, season's greetings to everyone out there, all our loyal viewers. Christmas is gone. Yeah. But a happy, it's hard to talk about a happy new year in a program like this. But let's hope that the new year will bring change to this country. Because I hear people out there, what you all want is change. What we want is change. Not change for the worse, but change for the better. But however despondent you may be, however frustrated you may be, however fed up you may be, in the end, only you, the ordinary people out there, can bring about the change and the difference. So we've got to rally in the new year and speak not only to those who are tormenting us, but also speak to those who are supposed to protect us from the torment. Let us raise our voices as ordinary working people and non-working people of this country, the sufferers, the toilers. Let us raise our voices and to say that we are people too. We are Guyanese too, and we deserve better. We have suffered too long, and it's time that we have the real change that we signaled in 2011 that we wanted.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Hinds, for being on the program. I do look forward to you being here during your stay more quite frequently as you can possibly. And to the people out there, let's hope that the new year really does bring us the kind of changes that we want. Do enjoy the rest of your evening. See you next week, same time, same channel, for another program of Walter Rodney Groundings. Good night.